Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
There is a lot happening in political Wales at the moment, with the new special, or not very special, relationship between the UK Labour government and its Welsh counterpart, the looming expansion of the Senedd, and the party shenanigans as they prepare for the new voting system, and the burning policy platforms in almost every field. Health, education, rural affairs, where do we begin? So who better to look at the state of Wales than Wales's leading independent journalist, writer of an award-winning newsletter, and the host of a Welsh politics podcast, Will Hayward. Hi, Will.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys.
Welsh politics podcasters have got to look after each other, Will.
We are a rare breed.
Last time you were here, you were the Welsh affairs editor at Wales Online, contributor to stations like Time Radio and guest on BBC Wales' excellent satire, What Just Happened, producing Wales by Little Wonder. But now your situation has changed completely, Will. So I have to ask the question, what has happened?
I am very poor. So in mid-September, I left Wales Online after 8 years, almost exactly 8 years, and I've gone freelance. So my primary source of income is now my newsletter, which imaginatively is called the Will Hayward newsletter. I wasn't able to take my previous newsletter from Wales Online, so I started another one, exactly the same name. And so I do that, and I do, as you say, a podcast, not as insightful as this one, but a podcast about Welsh politics called For Wales, See Wales.
So obviously you're now a member of the Welsh Political Podcasting Union, and we're always happy to see new members. Tell us a little bit about For Wales, See Wales, and what the core idea of the pod is and what you see as the future trajectory of the podcasting space in Wales.
So the podcast, I think it's I like to think of it as like an accessible look at Welsh politics, but not necessarily just politics, kind of Welsh issues. So I think there's a big untapped market, if we're going to look at it like filthy capitalists, as of people who are not engaged with Welsh politics, with Welsh issues, or really with Wales as kind of almost a polity generally. And I think what decisions that are made in Wales massively affect them, but they're not engaged with them, which I think in turn makes those decisions more likely to be poor decisions or ill thought through decisions because there's not the scrutiny or engagement on it. So the idea was to create something which is accessible for people who aren't naturally inclined to be interested in politics, and hopefully get them up to speed's the wrong word, but just engaged, for want of a better phrase. So
you're basically our gateway drug.
Yeah, I'm the cannabis to your smack. I think the thing I've always really liked about this podcast, not to blow smoke up here at all, but is I cover Welsh politics, and it's like my job, written books about it. I always felt like when I listened to this podcast, I was more informed and I knew more what was going on, and I felt in a better position to understand the country in which I lived. And so often I'd listen to what you guys would say, and I'd be like, God, this is actually really, really important. But people who aren't, as I say, not naturally inclined, politics isn't for them. They don't do politics. It'd be quite heavy to go like, it'd be like you've never drank and then you go to Magaluf. So I think, yeah, I think this is almost like a politics light. And I don't think we dumb down our content in terms of how we cover things. I think we cover important stuff, but it probably doesn't have the same kind of forensic detail that you guys would do. I'd say it's probably the way to describe it, because like it's ultimately there's three people on it. There's me and there's two comedians, Robin Morgan and Mel Owen, who are both really not just lovely people. They're really strong, like comedic minds, and they think in a totally different way to how I do as a journalist. And I think that just helps make it quite accessible and easy to listen to.
Yeah, well, I'm going to draw a line under the intoxicating substances metaphors now. If only we were as addictive as Smack, that would be great for our subscriber count. But we need to talk about your other news, which is you are now a regular columnist at The Guardian. Despite the excellent work of Stephen Morris over the years, covering both Wales and the English West Country, The Guardian has always come under a fair bit of criticism for its lack of coverage of Wales, including special demerits for relying on Simon Jenkins's contributions over the years. So, what has your experience been of working with The Guardian and talking about Welsh politics for a publication based across the border?
Yeah, I mean, because Steve Morris is Wales and the Southwest, isn't he? And I mean, the guy is like a machine. The amount of content he produces and the amount of journalism he does is fantastic. My experience working with the Guardian has been great. Like I'm just about to submit my second column. I'd written something for them previously a couple of years ago on Welsh independence, but my first column was on HS2 in my new role. It's great. I mean, it's different to Wales Online. It's also different because of the role I've got. Like at the moment now, I'm a columnist. I put forward like opinion pieces, whereas before I was a reporter. What I really liked about the offer they made is there's a real genuine desire to cover Wales better. And I think in a way a columnist can do that, providing they're kind of informed on the topic which they're talking about in a way that I keep saying that word accessibility, but it's almost, I'm not just writing for people in Wales, it's also you're writing for people in the wider UK and actually beyond. I mean, they have huge readership in other countries as well. So you've got to kind of assume that people don't know that much about Wales. But actually, that's kind of good practice if you're writing in Wales as well, because people are so like not necessarily across it. It's been fantastic. I mean, over the like last few years, I've had offers to work at kind of covering politics at a few London-based publications, but I've wanted to stay covering Wales. I don't really enjoy the kind of analogy that regional journalism is a gateway to national media, in the same way that many politicians might see that as well. But I think it's been great to be given that platform to talk about, you know, the country I like, and because also there's so much low hanging fruit, because so much of Wales is not covered. Like there's stuff that to us will be like, well, obviously everyone knows that, but actually so many people don't. Like the HS2 stuff, I'm sure. I mean, everyone's been banging on about that in Welsh politics for kind of 10 years, and when we published it, people were messaging me going, "Oh my god, I had no idea." And I was like, "You've read my previous stuff, and you obviously haven't." But yeah, it's great. I love it. It's really nice. I think, with the exception of David Nicholson at the Morning Star, I think I might be the only national journalist based in Wales permanently. I'm happy to be corrected on that. I think I am.
No, I think you're probably right, and I know that we've had PA when Bronwyn was at PA. We had Bronwyn on a little while ago, and someone at Reuters as well was covering Wales, but not so much. And I'll obviously grumble endlessly about the idea of national journalists being based in London and regional journalists being the ones that represent Wales. I mean, that's just grit in my oyster. But we also have we also have two sets of Welsh politics podcast hosts coming together here. We should probably talk shop a little bit about that. So what do you think the sort of scope is for podcast, other kind of digital media, sort of building a new type of news business in Wales, and, you know, where there's scope for innovation in terms of what is covered here that maybe, you know, historically wouldn't have been covered in Wales?
I'll kind of, if it's right, include like the newsletter in that as well, because the newsletter I'm doing, it's a paid for newsletter. So people can subscribe for free, but they can also pay per month. They can pay for a year. And there's also a thing called like founding member where you can pay whatever you want. And it blows my mind that people are willing to pay more than the going rate, but fair play to them. What I think the good thing about this with podcasts and newsletters is that it enables you to provide an income while being quite niche. I actually don't think Wales should be considered niche. There's 3 million of us. But what's really exciting about it is the more that it's created, I think I've heard Matt say before that whole rising tide lifts all boats. And I think when you get interest in stuff and you create, it is an ecosystem whereby everything kind of feeds off each other. I mean, that was one of the very few times that I've seen a story snowball in Wales, where someone would do something and someone else would pick it up and someone else would pick it up, which you get all the time in London. Was the Vaughan Gethin story. It felt like a few of us in Wales were banging the drum about that for 3 or 4 months, and then suddenly it caught light and people were like, this is a really big story, and stories would feed other stories, so someone would break something and then someone would take that piece on. So I think it's actually really, really exciting, because I do think, like we saw after COVID, I don't think the genie will go back in the bottle with regard to like people being aware of. You're not aware that the Welsh government has control over your hospitals, and then you forget. Like once you know that they're the people responsible, you know they're the people responsible. And I think it's really exciting, because what's been weird for me the last 6 weeks is I've been approaching journalism from a business perspective as opposed to just I write stuff, like thinking about, right, how am I going to market this? Who am I approaching with this? How am I getting sponsorship? All this sort of stuff. Like, I'm really lucky that I've managed to get a sponsor on the newsletter. That's been financially really helpful. But it's exciting because if you're somewhere like Wales Online, you've got huge kind of fixed costs. You've got offices, you've got pensions, you've got legacy costs, you've got all sorts of things. Whereas I don't. And so it wouldn't be necessarily profitable for someone like Wales Online to do what I'm doing, but it is for me to do it. Well, touch wood.
Are you telling me that we're not going to get a print edition of the Will Hayward newsletter?
You can print it off if you want. You can whip out the cannon, blow the dust off, and pay a lot for a printer cartridge. But no, I won't be providing a print edition. I don't know what that's going to offer.
R.I.P. the National, everybody.
I thought the people involved on the ground floor of that were fantastic, and I thought I think the people higher up probably didn't realise how good the thing they had was and what their actual market was. But it's easy for someone as an outsider, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I know. I didn't mean that in a.
Oh no, not you.
No. I know. It is a really sad state of affairs. Just a little anecdote about this. I remember getting offered to do a paper review from a TV channel, and they said to me, "Oh, well, we'd love you to do the paper review, but we'd love you to come on and do some Welsh papers as well." And I said, "Okay, which ones?" And they said, "Well, how many national, regularly daily printed newspapers do you have?" And I went, "Oh, well, I suppose at best 2, maybe 3." And it's that pushing it. So, the loss of the Nationals is a huge loss to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was exciting when that opened, wasn't it? It felt like, it was just so against the prevailing narrative. I'm not the best placed person to discuss kind of what didn't work, but I think there was it was really exciting, like, journalistically, to see that, and it helped some really great reporters like find their feet.
100%. So we've talked about the sort of state of the Welsh media landscape, which is, promising. But what's your assessment of the general state of the political landscape? Obviously, we've just had a general election. Everyone's eyes are now turning towards 2026. If you were doing a health checkup on the Welsh political system, Will, how would you score it?
It's like a lot of comorbidities, lots of underlying health conditions.
Spoken like a true reporter who's covered the health beat. That's great.
What scares me most about politics in Wales is I don't think the people at the top of politics in Wales realise how much trouble they're in. Like, some do, but I think many of them don't. I don't think they realise how well reform is going to do. I was at their conference last weekend, and they just don't seem to get it. They don't seem to. I think because, especially Labour, they've just been in power for so long. They see these things as a blip. That it's almost inevitable they'll always have a footing, but that isn't. There's no inevitability in that, especially because they've created a. If I was Nigel Farage and someone had said to me, right, I want you to choose this voting system for the Senedd, and I think he'd have designed what they've done. Overall, I think Wales has lots and lots of issues. I think the people in charge are, even if they were on the top of their game and they were the elite of the elite, I think they would struggle given the tools available to them. And I don't necessarily think they're the elite of the elite. So I'm just going to spread the joy.
So in your book, Will, your book on independence, you talked an awful lot really about how devolution itself wasn't really functioning particularly well. Do you think that's still your assessment? Not necessarily talking about the parties in charge, but just the pure mechanism of everything. Do you think it really is struggling to function now?
Yeah, I just it doesn't work. I mean, there's that Senedd committee report recently which just said so much of it relies on just the goodwill and whims of people in Westminster. I think it works terribly for Wales. I think it works a little bit better for Scotland, and I think it works really terribly for England in the main. I think people in England certain parts of England have got just as many reasons to be pretty disappointed with how we're constituted. It's so frustrating that so little of what happens for Wales is based upon what would make the most sense for Wales. Just the entire funding model, that essentially our funding's based upon what England needs, but really it's what England's assessed need is from one small part of the political system. It's really quite depressing, because the more you cover Wales journalistically, the more you see not just the issues, but the impact the issues have on people who live here's everyday life. And you just think, wow, we're not even equipped to tackle this, as I say, if we had people who were really, really on it and energized, all singing from the same hymn sheet. It would be hard, but we're not. And so it is actually quite depressing. I realise I'm probably the most miserable guest you've ever had.
Bet you're a ray of sunshine compared to the Hiraeth group chat, Will. Should we start by talking about Welsh Labour, if we're talking about parties? I mean, 2024 has been probably the most chaotic and difficult for Welsh Labour in memory. Obviously, we had the contortions and fallout of the Vaughan Gething election and brief tenure. That feels like a lifetime ago. Now that the dust has settled around that, how do you read the sort of state of Welsh Labour and Welsh Labour leadership under Senedd Morgan and Hayward Davies?
I think the Vaughan Gething saga, for want of a better word, I don't feel like it's weird to call it a saga. I think that presented a hell of a lot of questions for Welsh Labour. And I think in a way they've had the worst of both worlds, because they've had all the turmoil of these questions about what they're trying to do, who they are, what the aim is, without actually you've had all the pain without actually the benefit of getting through that and answering those questions. Senedd Morgan and Hugh Aranka are probably the best sticking plasters they could have come up with. But it's that thing of, I don't think they acknowledge the situation that they are in. They've been unpopular for a very long time. They did very well in 2021 on the back of essentially Mark Drakeford's personal popularity, in my view, and a pretty anemic opposition. And also, we've just gone through Brexit, so that kind of Brexit party element of the opposition wasn't really that coherent. So there's a very high watermark, and they seem to think that kind of small tinkerings might win people over. But I mean, it kind of relates to what's happened with Starmer, because whoever you voted for in the last general election, I think everybody, even Conservative voters, felt like we needed change. We needed some change. And UK Labour have come in and just been so miserable. There's been no hope. And I think a key part of being a leader, you can't pretend there's not a black hole in the finances. You can't pretend there's not difficult decisions to make, but you can give people a decent vision for the future and a reason to keep believing. And I think they've completely failed to move from campaign mode in terms of their messaging to governing mode. And it's the same with Welsh Labour. I mean, what's the best case scenario of waiting lists? Sorry, I know I'm just talking, but what's the best case scenario for waiting lists for them in 18 months' time? They're down 10%. I mean, they're going up at the moment. Our waiting lists are only a little bit lower than the highest they've ever been. I just don't see how they come up with any offering unless they go incredibly bold with and renew. And there's just no desire within that group for that.
What I think has surprised a lot of people, myself included, is that for many years we've had talk about what the benefits of a Labour duopoly in England and Wales would be for people living in Wales. And not only have we not seen a huge amount of that, it just simply in terms of, as you've quite rightly said, is sort of like the general tone and timbre of the conversation and the dialogue between the two governments. But we've actually seen no manifest real improvements or advantages to Wales for having been so loyal to Labour through the dark period when they've been out of office in Westminster. And, you know, there was much crowing around the additional money, which has been undoubtedly good for Wales from the UK government budget, as it has been actually proportionally slightly better for Scotland and Northern Ireland, SNP Scotland and, you know, Sinn Féin and DUP Northern Ireland. And I just wonder what your take is about the kind of relationship there, because one would have thought, and certainly my thought strategically would be, if they want to help their colleagues in Cardiff be re-elected in 2026, they would be making a strategic decision to plough investment and money into Wales in order to boost their party colleagues. But it doesn't feel like that's happening.
The first thing to say is, if you go back to that question where you said, do feel like the system at the moment doesn't work, the fact that Wales getting a major funding would essentially be because Labour think, oh, that'll be advantageous in 18 months, I think is a terrible way to allocate resources in the first place. But, you know, politics is like. politics that will inevitably happen. Although it's not happening, is it? Like I spoke to several Labour MSs who I think they're from a certain part of the party, but they are incredibly disappointed that they are going to have nothing really to offer in term when it comes to 2026. I've spoken to Labour MPs, one in particular who said to me, I said, is there going to be anything coming to Wales before 2026? And they said there'll have to be. They acknowledge that something needs to be offered. There needs to be something given just to change that narrative. But I don't see what they can really offer, because say we are going to give the HS2 money, which would be an enormous shift from it'll be an enormous shift from what they've said since they've been elected. It wouldn't be an enormous shift from what they said before they were elected. Even if they were to do that, that is really just money Wales is owed. Like, if you're offering to Wales is, we're going to treat you fairly. I don't feel like that is actually that much of a kind of, like, we're going to give you a little bit towards coal tips. Like, there's no doubt that the last budget has given Wales considerably more money than it would have had before. It's probably eased the pain that authorities were going to be facing, but local authorities in particular. But what it doesn't do, like, your pitch to people can't be, you're in less pain than you would have been. I also think that when we come into the run-up to the Senedd election, I could see those Welsh Labour trying to distance themselves from UK Labour just through pure self-preservation. But by then it's just too late. And would a Leonard Morgan really do that?
And as many people have said, the key thing to being re-elected or being elected in the first place historically has always been delivery. And I think, the question really is, what can the Labour Party do in the 18 months or so now to show that it's delivering better than it perhaps has done in recent times? What if anything, would you say, if you had the ear of somebody, what would you recommend that they focus on?
I mean, they're not going to get rid of waiting lists, are they? They're not going to tackle 2-year waits. They're not going to be able to do that. And and a big part of that is because the reason for the waiting lists are deeply ingrained issues. It's not a lack of desire, and it's not a lack of hard work that's keeping those waiting lists high. You can't just come in and be like, yes, we're really going to focus on this now.
Have a listening exercise. I think that will help. If they have a listening exercise, that really...
I think you'll find, actually, that was a data collection exercise. If I was them, what I would try and do is something which seizes the narrative a bit. Like, you don't have to do something that's going to be universally popular, but you just being seen to do something radical and rethinking. If they were to say, we are going to... It's a really easy thing to say, we're going to cut the number of health boards or cut the number of local authorities. I actually don't think that solves anything. It's how they're run, isn't it? But actually, if they were to say, well, actually, we're going to completely restructure how this institution, for instance, the health service, is governed, because that is within our gift, and we're going to rationalise it, and the fruits of that won't bloom for like 2 or 3, 4 years, but this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it. That would be all anyone is talking about. At the moment, their biggest risk is they're seen as doing nothing. I think if you do something that's controversial or is at least noteworthy, I think they just need to be seen to be at least have some kind of dynamism, and I don't think they do. But have been starved of funds for a very, very long time, and they're not suddenly going to be able to make things better. They're in a very, very impossible place. In an ideal world, the general election was 5 years before the Senedd election, and you have plenty of time. You have, like, Drake. I saw Drakeford speaking at an event recently, and he said that money that they've just received is a down payment on future payments. And I do believe that after 5 years of Labour, Wales will be receiving considerably more financially than it will have done at the start of that period. But if we're talking from Labour maintaining any kind of dominance in Wales, I think that's going to be too little too late.
Will, you've talked about the Welsh Conservatives probably more than anyone apart from the Welsh Conservatives. I know they come up frequently on Wales v Wales. Recent news in the party, obviously, they failed to elect someone who wanted to reopen the conversation on devolution as their party chair, backing a more pro-Devo candidate. I mean, that's quite surprising for a number of us who assumed the membership was very abolish in Wales. What is your assessment of the Conservatives as an opposition group? And do you think they have the ability to make forward strides in Wales? Or do you think with the rise of reform, they may find themselves falling back into 3rd or 4th place?
I actually think both of those things. I think they could be a rational and fairly moderate Welsh Conservatives would be exactly what Wales needs. I think that massively counters the threat from reform in lots of areas, but I don't think they will. I think they will fall into fourth place behind reform. If you are in Wales and you want an alternative to Labour, where do you go? You could go to Plaid, but Plaid have obviously got that historic issue where they struggle to appeal who aren't either Welsh speakers or firmly identify as Welsh ahead of British. If you don't want Plaid, your other option is the Welsh Conservatives, and they are essentially just reform, but they don't do it as well, and they have all the baggage of having been in government in Westminster for the last 14 years. Or you go for you got Lib Dems, which, where are they? So obviously there's the Greens, but they have that same offering as Plaid with regards to independence and stuff like that. So really, you then naturally, I can see why people would gravitate to reform. If you had a Welsh Conservative Party that have a real Welsh offering, I think people would be willing to hear it. But with the current party membership that they have and the group within the Senedd that they have, I just don't see them having the wherewithal to do it. And why reform, I think, is such a threat, because you've got a Welsh government which you can argue aren't doing enough to make people's lives better, but then there is no seemingly credible alternative. So I can understand why people would look elsewhere. So yeah, I think under the current leadership of Andrew Davies, I mean, you've seen Succession. You know when the Logan Roy character just goes, oh, "You are not serious people." That is kind of how I feel about him. He's not serious. He's not serious about governing. He's serious about remaining leader of the Welsh Conservatives.
But they are a much weaker sort of institutional force now. They've lost all their MPs in Wales as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've seen some interesting comments about devolution from Kemi Badenoch. You've seen some interesting comments in general from Kemi Badenoch that don't even seem like they are trying to LARP the sort of populist right. They just seem to be highly ideological, small c, shrink the state kind of conservative comments. And I don't think that's where the country is. Obviously, they have appointed a new shadow Secretary of State for Wales in Mims Davis, but she does not represent a Welsh seat. But you do also see interesting attack lines like Tom Tuggenhat trying to go on Joe Stevens for the Welsh language, even though the incident in question where he says Ynys Môn or Anglesey as you know it, when I've never heard Joe say anything but Ynys Môn, is a very interesting tact. But why do you think they are trying? Is it a sort of throw everything at the wall approach and see what sticks, or do you think they are just trying to LARP that sort of populist right in an attempt to try and win back support from reform?
I'd say there's three elements to it. The first one is, I think, when you haven't got much in the way of ideas to put forward, you just revert to type. And I think there's quite a deep Devo scepticism within the Welsh Conservative Party, and it feels natural just to go to where you're comfortable. I was just at the Reform conference, and Nigel Farage was very, very careful to make clear that they are not going to be opposing devolution. Don't get me wrong, every person I spoke to there hated devolution, but they did not want that to be on their ticket when they run in 2026, because they know, although there is, I think, quite widespread scepticism with the Welsh government and devolution in Wales, a lot of people still support it, and actually more support it than don't. So if you're going to go in very aggressively Devo skeptic, you risk alienating people when actually you want to win as many seats as possible. So Reform have been quite careful and thought it through, whereas the Tories seem to be some of them I've spoken to who aren't even particularly Devo skeptic. They want to put forward a decent offering, will say, well, if we were to be opposed, that kind of might differentiate us from Reform. That could counter Reform. But I just think that as a kind of a strategy might appeal very much to some people, but I think it leaves huge swaths of the electorate in Wales who you could potentially get on side. I think you risk alienating them. So I think many Tories are reversing to type. I think some of them think it might be a good way to counter Reform, but it's just not thought through. It's not a coherent message, is it?
Yeah, I mean that is quite an extraordinary thing, and it's interesting, of course, that the Senedd has saved the Conservatives in Wales twice now. Obviously in 97 and 2001 when they had the electoral wipeout, and it was the Senedd group that was elected that essentially kept the party afloat. And similarly here we are again. And it's quite interesting that you kind of allude to the fact that there seems to be more strategy in the last 6 months from Reform than there has been in the last 20 so years from the Welsh Conservatives. It's certainly it's a take.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got some elements of the party who are still those kind of just old school Welsh Conservatives who are quite small C in their outlook, but they've been supporters of the Welsh Party for a long time, and for a long time the party was pro devolution. They wanted to make it work. They wanted to win seats. There's not hundreds of them, but probably are literally just hundreds of them. But I think you see several party grandees actually coming out and saying, well, actually, we're not a devo-skeptic party. We're not opposed to devolution. We were skeptical. We opposed it. It's now here. We support it. And I just think it's a fight that really isn't worth having. There's so much low-hanging fruit if you want to criticise the Welsh government. I don't think you need to go down the devo-skeptic route. I just think why not just focus on schools and hospitals, for crying out loud?
You mentioned, Will, that you'd been at Reform UK Welsh Conference, which I think a lot of people will have seen took place in early November, and hit a different note to most Welsh party conferences in that it made the news in Wales, which was interesting for various reasons. You mentioned in your newsletter that the Reform conference didn't really cover much in terms of Wales or Welsh issues. And you mentioned that the key pillars of their support came from sort of a desire for hope. And you also said that a desire for improvement in the NHS, which, probably not the two words that you would think about in terms of when people first think of reform in Wales. What do you mean by hope?
I think it's fair to say that senior members of the party, politicians and staff, were hammering the immigration bandwagon like anything. Like, they were not shut up about it. I mean, some of the quotes were just pretty terrifying, really. But a lot of the people I spoke to, who it might have been their first Reform conference, quite a lot of them, they've gone along because they just are very disillusioned with what's happened. And I mean, I spoke to one woman and I said, why are you supporting Reform? She goes, well, for a lot of us in rural Wales, it's about loneliness. And, I worry about the future for our grandchildren. And I was saying, well, do party policies really combat loneliness? But then I realised kind of what she's talking about is community. And if you live in a rural part of Wales, quite a lot of places of Wales, and your infrastructure is terrible, your internet's slow, kids are moving away because they can't get jobs, and your high street's going to hell. That sense of community and that sense of we are going in the wrong direction is real, and I think legitimate. What Reform do is, I think they point entirely the wrong direction for the reasons, and actually they have zero things to actually offer in terms of how they would improve it, except for be different. But there's something very quantifiable there that they're tapping into, and I think almost without exception, every person I spoke to at the Reform conference who was essentially just a member of the Welsh public wanted what most people want. They want a better future. They want to be in a better place economically, in terms of their life, but also for their family. And they've landed on Reform as the solution to that. Also, the NHS just came up over and over and over again. I mean, for the last 20 years, 30 years, there's been people on the very far right of politics who have been banging the same drum as Reform are now. I remember like Nick Griffin on Question Time and stuff. But the reason that those messages are now being able to catch hold in a much more real way is because what we have at the moment isn't succeeding in making people's lives better. So it's just ringing a better chord. I think they're just saying the same thing they've said for a long time. Obviously, things like social media massively help in terms of amplifying that voice. But I think the failure of, I hate the phrase, like mainstream parties to meaningful, like I hate the phrase mainstream media. If someone says a phrase mainstream media, just ignore them. They know what they're talking about. But yeah, so I think those are the things that came up for me. The NHS and a lack of hope for the future were the two main things.
I don't know how accurate this is reflected in the people at their conference, but a huge growth area for them is sort of men under 35. Why do you think that is, and it's in a market that also was a huge success area for people like Trump. What is it that's attracting younger men to parties like Reform or Trump, these sort of strongman figures?
I think why young men are gravitating towards that kind of politics is incredibly multi-layered and very, very complicated. If you're a young, potentially politically disengaged man, before like mass social media, where would you have accessed those ideas? It'd probably been through speaking to someone in a pub or for a sports team or something like that. And that is a much harder way to spread ideas. Whereas when you can put something out and it can just go into thousands of feeds in minutes and get shared, and by the very fact they're shared, that point of view is vindicated. I think it's tough. My impression at the conference was, I wouldn't say it was young men. I would say that it was 30 to 40-year-old men, but it seemed to have cut through with a lot. A lot of the staffers in Reform are quite young blokes. They strike me as the sort of guys who would use the term alpha male non-ironically, was what I would kind of characterize them as. But people in the crowd, there was a lot of kind of men, I was surprised, aged 30 to 40, which you would get them at a Plaid conference, but they'd be such nerds. And you'd get them at a Tory conference, but they'd be dressed like they're 90 and from the early 1900s. But at Reform, they were kind of 30 to 40-year-olds, blokes, a lot of hats. There was a couple of MAGA hats there. I actually spoke to quite a few of them. And they were talking to me about stuff like, what would you do to fix the NHS? And older people will say, cut out waste, cut out waste, cut out waste. Those guys actually almost all said to me that we were talking to me about carcinogens and the fact that we don't want fluoride in toothpaste. So they've probably gone down certain rabbit holes, I would say.
Wow. RFK Jr., they'll be driving around with a chopped up whale head on their car down the M4. That's quite a niche US political reference. I'm sorry if anyone's listening and likes whales. We must carry on. I mean, just in terms of Reform, I mean, what I found interesting about Reform, just to divert you briefly, is we had Oliver Lewis on our general election pods, who is I think the Wales spokesman for Reform. I'm not entirely sure how that works. Interesting guy, and cuts a different tone to a lot of the rest of the party rhetoric, and has been kind of touting around a whole bunch of interesting policies that actually show that they're thinking about what devolution could do in an interesting way. And the thing that's tickled me most about it is that they're considering coming out in favour of supporting policing and justice devolution in a way, albeit to do something quite different, in a way that Plaid Cymru and Lib Dems and the Greens are after. But you're right that there's a general vibe of not really having to talk about Wales in order to win or seats in Wales. And, we saw that in July, where Reform came second across huge swathes of Wales, particularly the South Wales coalfield and up in the northeast, without really having what traditional parties would consider like a ground game or a policy platform. And do you think that they actually need to develop that infrastructure to do well in 26? Or is this something that the kind of style, the sort of presidential style, the sort of convention rather than conference kind of vibe from Newport can carry them into the Senedd in 26?
I actually interviewed Oliver Lewis as well at conference. He's quite he's an interesting guy to talk to. And he's clearly a smart bloke. He's clearly has a brain on him. When we talk about Reform developing policies, I think Oliver's developing policies. I got no impression from anyone else there that this was a melting pot of ideas where they were going to thrash out their future direction. I think their aim is to be in power and to have as much power and as many elected representatives as possible. And he is trying to answer some questions they might get on the way to doing that. That was the impression I got.
Do they need more than that to win in 26, win seats?
I don't think they need to win seats, because Oliver can talk about policies they can have and things like that. But ultimately, Farage and Lee Anderson and were saying as little as possible about how they were going to do anything. And that was because they don't need to. You don't need to attract the whole electorate to win an election. You need to tap into something. And disenfranchisement with politics is a very big thing. And if you can just say, the NHS isn't working, that's unequivocal. Waiting lists are long, unequivocal. If they're speaking to someone in Wales, they probably are or know someone on a waiting list. Just statistically, that's probably quite likely. And you say the answer to that is us. There is lots of waste. There is money wasted. That is really all you need to say, because people aren't digging down into healthcare policy. I asked people, what would you want them to do? And, one of them said that we need more organic food. And it's like, yeah, I mean, there's probably merit in that, but I don't think the reason we're on a waiting list is because we're all having battery farmed hens. So you don't need to say more. And that's kind of what's a bit scary about it all, isn't it? That actually the best ideas aren't going to win. Well, I'm not saying that other people have amazing ideas, by the way, but you don't need any idea, really. You can just say, we are an alternative.
So you've been at the Reform Conference, and a few weeks ago we saw each other at the Plaid Cymru conference in Cardiff, where I was working, and so were you. They have an awful lot of hope for 2026. But if I remember correctly, you were a little bit sceptical about their proposed march to the top floor of Hayward.
With Plaid, my scepticism was because I don't think any of their policies were that. There was very little meat on the bones. I thought, their reaction to Tata about nationalising, I was like, okay, well, great. But you're going to be in charge of the Welsh government. You can't do that. That is not within your gift. That even if you won every seat in Wales in the general election, that would not be within your gift. With regard to healthcare, it essentially was, we're going to run it better, which really is what Reform said. I think for Plaid, I actually think one of the best things that they can do is actually, I've been thinking about this. I don't know if it is even they have to just say, here's loads and loads of policy detail. I think they can tap into that saying, we are not Welsh Labour. And they can essentially, their thing is to be, we go out to bat for Wales. Not like we are, obviously Plaid will also be absolutely key cog, will be defending the language, and rightly so. But their best thing to do is point at these people from Reform and say, they're not even from around here. They are like, when I interviewed Lee Anderson, he couldn't name any hospital in Wales. He took a punt at the Wrexham General Hospital. But when I said to Nigel Farage, Wales' biggest public sector organisation in special measures, he started talking about steel, because obviously he didn't know it was Betsy Cadwallader Health Board and stuff like that. So you need to hammer that your options are a Welsh Conservative Party, which lots of people won't be inclined to vote for a whole host of reasons. You've got Reform, who they are not even from around here. You've got Labour, who are, you can say they are a busted flush. They are managing a lot of our public services. I think that's how Plaid have to do it. They have their own form of populism, but it's not we are Wales, it's we are batting for Wales. We are going out, and we are, whatever happens, we will always put Wales first. We are not a staging point for a general election, which is how Reform sees it. And I think that's what they have to hit over and over again. But I'm sceptical about whether they can do it. I think they've got a leader who's got something about him at least. But whether they can do it financially, whether they've got kind of the organisational capacity to do it, I think I'm fairly sceptical.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of us share that scepticism. But also, I think the one point that's key to point out here is that Reen got an awful lot of attention during a general election, because there's a lot more media attention on a general election. And despite him performing well, as Lee Waters said to us recently, he's an actor journalist. Of course, he was going to perform well in front of TV cameras. He did perform very well, and they had a good campaign. But I mean, apart from us on this Zoom call and a few dedicated others in the BBC and Wales and Lion Nation, ITV, etc., there's not a huge media landscape in Wales to cover these kind of elections. And parties like Reform are probably going to get more attention just the time. Labour, obviously, being the UK government, will get national attention as well. The Conservatives is the main opposition party in Westminster, more media attention. It's always going to be really hard for Plaid Cymru to break through, even if they come up with the best narrative ever, simply because there's just not enough media coverage that the average 46% or so of the population that vote in Senedd elections is consuming on a regular enough basis.
You know what? Plaid's best hope of getting UK-wide coverage is to essentially, if they can get to polling well enough that the UK-wide media thinks, oh my God, it's an SNP situation, which everyone in Wales knows it wouldn't be an SNP situation. There's not going to be that kind of same groundswell of like that Labour wipeout over to Plaid Cymru. But if you could portray that is a threat, that a nationalist party, a party that wants independence, could win substantial amounts be the largest party in the Senedd. If you can create that narrative, I think that UK-wide media would take a look at it, because obviously the UK media only looks at Wales through the lens of England. So when they look at Scottish politics, it's with a view to what this means for independence, because they don't really scrutinise the SNP's record in any meaningful way, because that isn't really an England thing. So yeah, it's tough. I mean, a really good example is how the Reform conference worked. So normally you have a room where there's like the press room, and then you get given a time you can interview a politician. You go out the press room, you do it, and you come back and you type it and you send it into the world, or you do your video. They decided to set up the studio for interviewing Farage in the press room, so we all had to watch each other's interviews. GB News were first, obviously, and I have a rule which I never ever criticise any other journalists, because they get enough, and it's just I hate it. I hate people who criticise it. I wish people applied the same thing to me, but they don't. GB News, it was arse-kissingly disgusting. It made you want to retch. It was awful.
Well, he is still a presenter on GB News.
Of course he is. But they asked one question about Wales. It was the first question. It was, look how shit things are in Wales. Obviously, Sky have got some amazing journalists, and they did a really good interview, but still, only one of their questions were about Wales at the Welsh conference. And it was with a point of view of things are challenging in Wales, aren't they? There was no real insight into it. And I think that, as you say, sums up the problem that's going to be. It's like you can have all these people come to Wales and they still won't talk about it.
Only Newport, though. They didn't want to go too far in.
Where you get a nosebleed.
I mean, one more question on Plaid. I mean, this new electoral system is much better for parties that are not so geographically concentrated. Now, Plaid are a party whose support has been extremely geographically concentrated into what we thought, what us nerds call Ifro, the West Wales coast and Ynys Môn. Do you see them breaking through that in this new Senedd system? Are they going to reclaim that momentum like they felt they had in the valleys under Leanne? Are they going to be able to break through in the industrial northeast? Or is it just a question of no matter how well Plaid poll, they're just topping up votes in places they're already doing well?
If I'm honest, I love making predictions. I always try and do it. I don't think anyone really who tells you they know how it's going to play out has any idea. I don't think they do. But I think if they're smart, and I was them, I would actually just say, right, North West Wales, West Wales coast, we've got it. Leave it. Just throw everything into maybe 2 or 3 seats. Go all out to try and win 2 or 3 seats outside of your traditional areas. Concentrate those resources there, thereby forcing Labour, the Conservatives, into also having to allocate some stuff there, because there's chances they pick up one person in every seat. Like there's chances of that, and then if you can win big in a particular area, they could do it. But it's such a hard thing to kind of work out, because obviously you've got the new constituency boundaries. We've never had a set of election under these. I think the last election was a little bit of an anomaly in terms of Labour support, because not only did Labour do well on the back of Drakeford, but also we didn't have, in terms of a Brexit party, really have any momentum at the time. We've just had Brexit. People were very Brexit fatigued. You had a Tory party who were actually at that particular point seen as getting Brexit done. So I think that skews everything. I think Plaid have got a reasonable chance if everything falls the right way. They have a really good campaign, and Labour don't manage to make a case. I think they've got a good chance of a alternative. I also think it might help that people who vote Plaid tend to vote in a Senedd election. Potentially, if you're a Plaid voter, you're probably going to turn out in a Senedd election, and it might be that other people are just so disengaged with it that they don't.
Finishing with a huge enthusiasm for Senedd electoral politics there, Will. Should we try and keep that up and start talking about the lesser parties? Lesser parties, that was a bit pejorative, wasn't it?
Oh, no. Call them lesser parties, because
Kerry's away for one.
How do you know I was going to talk about the Greens? I could have been talking about, I don't know, the Communist Party or you mentioned, yeah, absolutely. So we should talk briefly about the Liberals, the Greens, and even abolish. If the Conservatives have abolished their abolish policy, there's a chance that they might try and make a stand. What do you think, if any, there is scope for those smaller parties to sort of find some kind of electoral success? Because otherwise, we're looking at a very monocultural Welsh Parliament after 26.
Yeah, we are. I think abolish have got the advantage of their name, and actually, I think some people turn up and they go, "Yeah, I want that." There is an inherent advantage to that. I just think that the people who are inclined to do that will be so pro-reform that I think that'll be all-encompassing for that. With the Greens, I spoke to Anthony Slaughter, the leader of the newly re-elected leader of the Welsh Greens, who when they launched their manifesto for the general election, and he said that the place they feel confident or more confident is in Cardiff. Look at the numbers. I'm not 100% sure myself, to be honest, but he seemed fairly sure that they could get something there. I mean, it's not unprecedented that Plaid and the Greens have some kind of pact, some kind of alliance where they sit people in different places. I just have no idea how that could work in a way that would be advantageous to Plaid. So I just don't see how that could even happen. I mean, the weird thing with these electoral systems is they're very, very harsh on a party until they're not, and then they're very great. If you can get through that point, you're in a really good position. Like we saw with the Tories, first past the post was their best friend until it wasn't. And I know we don't have first past the post now, but the D'Hondt system, the way it works, once you can get through a certain threshold, you've got a chance of doing well. I can't see the Greens cutting through, to be honest, in any meaningful way, which I think just in terms of debate in Wales is a shame. Because I think they've brought stuff to Scotland.
And what about the Lib Dems? You'd forgotten about the Lib Dems, haven't you?
No, I just found it weird you'd made that plural.
Hey, there are
David
two.
And Jay
Hang
now.
on. Yeah, absolutely. There are two, Will.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's
I'm
very
going to put you on the Lib Dem naughty step now.
I know, I've been there a lot.
Isn't that part of the problem in Wales is that we want an alternative to Labour, and if you're going to go, and if you don't have a Lib Dems, the next point of call you go if you move right is Andrew R.T. Davis's Conservative Party. Like that's pretty. I mean, the Lib Dems, they tend to. I mean, they're just so. It's just. I'm just reading off the kind of stereotypical things you said about the Dems, aren't they? They tend to campaign well if they've got any foothold in a certain area. Brecon and Radnor. Well, it won't be Brecon and Radnor, will it? What's it called?
Brecon, Radnor, Clontarf, Swansea, East and Neath.
Yes, that very, very uniform constituency. I'd be surprised if they didn't have anyone, just given the numbers in the Senedd. They'll have some representatives, probably have more than one. But given how the polls are, they could matter. They could. I mean, they've got a really weird knack of just producing like one MS and them having huge influence potentially. We could see Jane Dodds having quite big influence when we come to the budget, couldn't we?
With a keystone Senedd member. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So to be fair, if you get a Lib Dem Senedd member, you could have one of the most powerful people in there. But no, I don't think there'll be a real force.
So there'll be somewhere between the most powerful Senedd member and nothing.
Yeah.
That's the kind of analysis that I pay £6 a month for at the Will Hayward newsletter.
Do you do the £6 a month? Actually, if you do £6 a month, you make me £12 better off than if you go the 50 quid a year. So thank you so much.
Happy to help.
Will, as always, it's a pleasure talking to you. we should probably give you an opportunity now to plug everything you haven't managed to plug during this this interview. What else are you doing at the moment?
I've been fairly shameless. I actually have a book coming out. I'm going to announce it properly on social media. By the time this comes out, it might have come out. In terms of stuff you can actually support me on, the big one is the newsletter. I took the plunge. This is what pays my bills. If you've ever valued the journalism I do, this is a way you can directly support it, much like Rich does with his £6 a month. Very grateful. It is quite hard to make journalism pay your bills, and I've been amazed at the uptake in the newsletter so far. But obviously the more the better. And that's called the Will Hayward newsletter. If you Google it, you might still find my old one at Wales Online, which is called The Journal now. So please, you can subscribe to that if you want. But if you want to support me, sign up for the Will Hayward newsletter. Elsewhere, there's the podcast, which you guys have been very kind about, which is called For Wales, See Wales, which would be, and we're following in the footsteps of podcast giants because we're hoping to do a live event next year. But you took Lee Waters, who was going to be one of the most outspoken ones, so we need to find someone else who's going to say interesting stuff as a guest.
Will, thank you very much. And if people want to hear more from you on social media, what remains of it as it's crumbling wreck?
On X, I'm Will Hay Cardiff. I'm on Threads. I'm on Blue Sky. I think I'm just Will Hayward or Will Hayward Journo on them. I'm Will Hayward Journo on Instagram. I'm Will Hay Journo, I think, on TikTok. TikTok scares me quite a bit, so I tend not to be very responsive on there. And if you've got any stories and stuff or you want me to look into, it's will@willhayward.co.uk.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Will. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials at HiraethPod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/HiraethPod.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.